And when I say family, I don't mean just children. I mean adult sons, daughters, grandchildren, slaves, property, finances, and basically the entire domestic universe orbiting him. Yes, even adult sons, married with children, possibly balding, still legally under dad. This authority included control over finances, marriages, careers, and in the earliest periods, even life and death decisions, which sounds horrifying, and sometimes was. But Rome didn't arrive at this system by accident. It was the result of deep fear. Fear of disorder, fear of divided authority, fear of households turning into little civil wars. Rome viewed the family as a miniature state, and every state, according to Roman thinking, needed one ruler, not a committee, not a group chat, one authority figure whose word ended arguments immediately. Efficiency over feelings always. In a world without police constantly present, without social safety nets, without bureaucratic oversight, the household had to regulate itself. The father's power assured responsibility flowed upward. If something went wrong, debt, crime, scandal, Rome knew exactly who to blame. Accountability mattered more than fairness. And here's the part people often miss. With power came obligation. A paterfamilias was legally responsible for everyone under his roof. Their debts, their crimes, their survival. If your household collapsed, Rome didn't care about excuses. You failed as a leader. This system discouraged rebellion inside the home. It forced unity. It made families stable economic units rather than emotional democracies. Rome wasn't trying to build happy households. It was trying to build predictable ones. Over time, this power softened. Abuse became frowned upon. Social pressure mattered. But the legal structure remained because it worked. Roman households were durable. They produced soldiers, workers, heirs, and taxpayers reliably, which is all the state really wanted. So yes, Roman fathers had terrifying authority. Not because Rome loved cruelty, but because Rome feared chaos more. And if choosing between emotional comfort and social stability, Rome chose stability every single time, and then wrote a law about it. Ancient Rome is famous for many achievements: roads, aqueducts, concrete, empire-wide bureaucracy. And yes, public toilets, communal public toilets with no stalls at all. Imagine a long stone bench with evenly spaced holes. Everyone sitting side by side conducting business, both personal and conversational. This was not a social failure. This was Roman efficiency. And naturally, Rome had rules for it. Public latrines weren't casual hangout spots. They were regulated spaces because sanitation in a city of over 1 million people was a matter of survival. Disease didn't politely knock. It moved in aggressively and refused to leave. So Rome treated bathroom behavior as a public health issue, not a private moment. There were expectations. You didn't linger too long. You didn't splash. You didn't cause a scene. Conversation was allowed, but not theatrics. Rome wanted order, not commentary, and absolutely no treating the latrine like a performance venue. One of the most infamous features was the shared cleaning sponge mounted on a stick and rinsed in salt water between uses. Before you recoil too hard, understand that Romans genuinely believed this was hygienic. Germ theory did not exist. Salt water seemed clean enough. And honestly, after a few months in ancient Rome, your standards adjusted dramatically. Rules existed to prevent chaos. If people fought over seats, lingered excessively, or turned latrines into social clubs, congestion happened. Congestion led to filth. Filth led to disease. Disease led to panic. Panic to unrest. Rome did not enjoy unrest. There was also a social aspect. Latrines were public, shared spaces that reinforced equality, at least temporarily. Rich and poor sat side by side. Senators and shopkeepers shared the same stone bench. Rome liked this. It reminded citizens that despite hierarchy, everyone participated in the same systems. And yes, even bodily waste was regulated. Human waste was valuable, used in tanning, cleaning clothes, and agriculture. Rome did not care who started unrest. It cared that unrest started. This wasn't about suppressing emotion. Romans mourned privately at home, within families. They cried. They remembered. They honored the dead. They just weren't allowed to turn grief into a public spectacle that could ignite political tension. Funerals were emotional events, and emotional events were dangerous in a city already buzzing with rumors, rivalries, and ambitions. There was also a class issue. Wealthy families could afford enormous dramatic funerals. Poor families could not. If grief became competitive, louder cries, bigger processions, more dramatic performances, funerals would turn into status contests. Rome had already learned that when elites compete publicly, someone ends up dead, and it's usually the Republic. So mourning was rationed. Think of it as emotional crowd control. Rome knew that feelings are contagious. Anger spreads, fear spreads, grief spreads. And once emotions start spreading, laws stop working. Hey, everyone. Tonight we're heading to ancient Rome, a place where you could rule half the known world, but still get fined for wearing the wrong color, crying too loudly at a funeral, or walking around at night looking suspiciously alive. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. In ancient Rome, clothing was not about expressing your personality, your mood, or your authentic self. It was about broadcasting one very important message: how much trouble you could legally cause. Fashion was not art. It was a warning system. And the loudest warning of all was purple. Purple dye was so expensive it bordered on parody. It was made by crushing enormous quantities of tiny sea snails, each one contributing a microscopic drop of pigment before dying for the cause of imperial drip. Thousands of snails for a single garment. The process smelled awful, took forever, and required trade routes stretching across the Mediterranean. Wearing purple was essentially walking around saying, I own resources you will never emotionally recover from. Naturally, Rome decided this color needed rules. Only emperors, senators, and top officials were allowed to wear significant amounts of purple. A fully purple toga was the ancient equivalent of wearing a flashing sign that read, I have authority, and you absolutely do not. It saved time. Instead of arguing, debating, or asking questions, you simply looked at the toga and thought, prison speedrun outfit. To modern people, this sounds dramatic. To Romans, it was practical. Rome was enormous, overcrowded, and tense. There were no uniforms, no ID cards, no helpful lanyards. You needed instant visual clarity. Purple did that job beautifully. No confusion, no awkward misunderstandings, no accidentally insulting someone who could legally ruin your entire bloodline. There was also an economic reason. Romans loved status a little too much. If purple hadn't been restricted, wealthy elites would have started competitive fashion wars, bankrupting themselves just to outflex each other at dinner parties. Rome had already learned that when rich men compete aggressively, republics collapse. Limiting purple was basically the ancient version of saying, "Please stop before this gets stupid." Breaking the rule was serious business. Wearing purple without permission was treated as impersonating authority. Rome did not enjoy that at all. This wasn't a fashion faux pas. This was identity fraud with sandals. So yes, Rome banned people from wearing a color. Not because they were petty, but because they understood something deeply Roman. Clear hierarchy prevents arguments. Arguments turn into violence. Violence ruins empires. And if all of that could be avoided by telling most people, "No, you may not wear the fancy snail color," Rome considered that a bargain. In ancient Rome, grief was allowed. Dramatic grief, however, was treated like an uncontrolled fire hazard. Romans believed mourning needed limits, not because they were emotionally repressed robots, but because they had learned through painful experience that public emotion spreads faster than logic and ends badly, very badly. When one person screamed, 10 joined in. When 10 cried, a crowd gathered. When a crowd gathered, Rome quietly prepared for a riot. So Rome regulated grief. Professional mourners existed. People paid to wail, cry, tear their hair, and perform sorrow at funerals. And yes, Rome regulated them too. How loudly they could cry, how long they could mourn, and how theatrical they were allowed to be, all had limits. Because nothing destabilizes a city quite like hired grief performers screaming at full volume in the streets. Women, in particular, were forbidden from excessive public mourning, loud wailing, self-harm gestures, dramatic hair pulling, or collapsing theatrically in public. Not because Rome hated women, but because these displays attracted crowds, and crowds attracted chaos. Stealing waste from latrines could actually get you fined. Rome did not waste waste. To modern people, Roman toilets sound horrifying. To Romans, they were marvels of infrastructure, running water, drainage, organization, rules. Rome didn't care about your comfort. It cared that its citizens didn't die of preventable illness. So yes, ancient Rome told people how to behave in the bathroom. Not because it was intrusive, but because without rules, even civilization itself starts to smell terrible. In ancient Rome, Nighttime was not romantic. It was not mysterious. It was not for a leisurely strolls beneath the moon. Nighttime was when bad decisions clocked in for their shift. Once the sun went down, Rome became a very different city. Streets were poorly lit. Buildings were tightly packed. Fires spread easily. Criminals thrived, and political conspiracies loved the dark the way mosquitoes love exposed skin. So Rome did what Rome always did when faced with danger. It assumed you were guilty until daylight proved otherwise. Walking around at night made you suspicious by default. Patrols watched the streets. Guards questioned people. And if you were out late without a very good reason, Rome assumed you were either planning something illegal or already halfway through it. This wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. Most fires started at night when people used lamps and torches indoors. Most thefts happened at night when shops were closed and streets were empty. Most assassinations, ambushes, and secret meetings happened at night when witnesses were scarce and shadows were cooperative. Rome responded by discouraging nighttime movement altogether. If you had to be out, you needed a reason. Work, emergency, official business. Wandering aimlessly was not considered a valid excuse. Rome did not believe in just going for a walk to clear my head. Night watchmen carried authority, and resisting them was a very bad idea. Rome preferred to inconvenience innocent people rather than allow criminals freedom. This was a recurring theme. There was also a fire risk. Rome burned frequently, catastrophically frequently. Entire neighborhoods could vanish overnight. Limiting nighttime movement reduced the chances of accidental fires and made it easier to identify who was responsible when one inevitably happened. Even elites weren't immune. Senators moved with escorts. Wealthy citizens stayed indoors. Darkness equalized everyone, and Rome hated uncertainty. To modern people, this feels oppressive. To Romans, it felt logical. The city was too big, too crowded, and too volatile to trust darkness. The night was unpredictable, and unpredictability was Rome's greatest enemy. So yes, Rome treated nighttime walkers with suspicion, not because it hated freedom, but because it understood something deeply uncomfortable. Most disasters don't announce themselves. They happen quietly after dark, and Rome preferred to be rude than surprised. In ancient Rome, suicide was not automatically illegal. That might surprise you. What was illegal, however, was deciding to die without first filling out the appropriate paperwork. Rome was many things, but spontaneous self-destruction was not one of them. If a Roman citizen wished to end their life, they were expected to submit a formal request to the authorities explaining why. Illness, irreversible disgrace, terminal suffering, loss of honor. These were considered acceptable reasons. I had a bad week was not. To modern ears, this sounds cruel. But to Rome, it was administrative common sense. Every Roman citizen existed inside a web of obligations. Families depended on them. Debts were tied to them. Inheritances flowed through them. Political alliances relied on them. If someone died suddenly, especially by their own hand, the consequences rippled outward. Legal chaos, disputed estates, angry creditors, confused heirs, and occasionally violence. Rome hated chaos more than death. By forcing people to explain themselves, the state filtered impulsive decisions from irreversible ones. Many petitions were denied, not because Rome wanted people to suffer, but because Rome understood something timeless. Humans make terrible choices when overwhelmed. Requiring approval added delay. Delay added reflection. Reflection saved lives. There was also a legal incentive. If someone committed suicide without approval, their property could be confiscated by the state. Families lost inheritance. Debts remained unpaid. Rome made it very clear dying irresponsibly was financially rude. On the other hand, approved suicides were handled with dignity. Property was protected. Families were spared legal punishment. Society acknowledged the decision as tragic but orderly. Rome preferred sadness with paperwork over chaos without it. And yes, there was a darker motivation. Rome relied on citizens, soldiers, taxpayers, administrators. Letting people remove themselves freely weakened the system. A state that allowed unrestricted self-destruction was, in Rome's eyes, a state slowly bleeding itself out. So suicide was tolerated, but only when it fit Rome's definition of reason. To us, it feels invasive. To Rome, it was preventative maintenance. Rome did not ask, "Are you suffering?" It asked, "Will this destabilize everything?" And if the answer was yes, the answer to you was no. In ancient Rome, what women wore was not considered a personal choice. It was considered a public statement, one that the state felt extremely qualified to manage. Roman law placed strict limits on women's clothing, jewelry, and visible wealth. How much gold you could wear, how elaborate your garments could be, how much sparkle was considered acceptable before society started asking uncomfortable questions. And yes, Rome absolutely counted. To modern ears, this sounds like moral panic. To Rome, It was damage control. Roman elites had a problem. Status competition, and women's fashion became one of the fastest ways to escalate it. Expensive jewelry, imported fabrics, and extravagant styling turned social gatherings into silent wealth battles. One necklace invited a larger necklace. One gown demanded a more outrageous gown. Rome watched this happen and thought, "Ah, this is how republics die." So the state intervened by restricting visible luxury. Rome tried to slow the arms race. These laws weren't about modesty in a modern sense. They were about preventing elite families from bankrupting themselves, trying to look superior at dinner parties. Rome had already seen enough politicians ruin their finances and then mysteriously recover through corruption. There was also a social clarity issue. Rome relied heavily on visual hierarchy. Clothing signaled marital status, social rank, and moral expectations. A married woman dressed modestly was seen as stable and respectable. Excessive display suggested independence, and independence made Rome nervous. Rome didn't fear women. It feared unpredictability. Jewelry limits also protected families economically. Gold worn in public was literally walking wealth. Theft, envy, and resentment followed. Rome preferred that wealth stay discreet, locked away, accounted for, and taxable. Naturally, Roman women hated these laws. They bent them. They layered jewelry creatively. They found loopholes. They borrowed. They exaggerated hairstyles instead. Roman men complained loudly, then quietly admired the results. Lawmakers passed new restrictions. Everyone ignored them again. This cycle continued for centuries. But the intent never changed. Rome wasn't trying to erase women from public life. It was trying to keep status competition from turning social life into a financial blood sport. To Rome, regulating women's appearance was regulating social pressure itself. And in a society obsessed with order, pressure was something you controlled or it controlled you. So yes, Rome told women what they were allowed to wear, not because it hated beauty, but because it feared what unchecked beauty did to politics. To modern audiences, gladiators look like ancient superstars. Crowds cheered their names. Graffiti praised them. People collected souvenirs with their images. Some even inspired obsessive fandom that would feel familiar to anyone who has ever seen a comment section lose its mind. But in ancient Rome, the law took one long look at gladiators and said absolutely not. Despite their fame, gladiators were legally CL. This meant they lost many basic rights. They could not vote. They could not hold office. Their testimony in court was limited. Legally speaking, they were closer to criminals than celebrities, which seems confusing until you remember that Rome hated mixed signals. Gladiators were violent by profession. They killed or were killed for entertainment. Rome understood the danger of glorifying that too much. If people started seeing gladiators as heroes rather than performers, you risked normalizing violence outside the arena. And Rome preferred its violence organized, scheduled, and ticketed. The dishonor status served as a psychological firewall. Yes, you could admire their skill. Yes, you could cheer. But no, you could not aspire to be them in any socially respectable way. Rome wanted admiration without imitation. There was also a class concern. Gladiators often came from enslaved people, prisoners, or the poor. If successful fighters gained full honor, social mobility would accelerate in unpredictable ways. Rome was many things, but flexible about hierarchy was not one of them. Even free men who volunteered to become gladiators were legally degraded. By stepping into the arena, they agreed to lose status. Rome made sure this choice came with consequences. You could gain money, fame, and attention, but you would lose dignity in the eyes of the law. No refunds. This prevented a flood of ambitious young men from abandoning military or civic careers to chase arena glory. Rome needed soldiers and administrators more than it needed influences with swords. And yet the contradiction remained. Romans loved gladiators. They fantasized about them. They gossiped about them. They scraped sweat from their bodies to use as cosmetics. Yes, really. Rome simply refused to let that admiration translate into power. So gladiators lived in a strange limbo, adored by the crowd, dismissed by the law, famous but untouchable, celebrated but contained. Rome understood something deeply uncomfortable. If you reward spectacle with status, spectacle eventually replaces governance. And Rome was not about to let a man with a helmet and a trident run the state. In ancient Rome, religion was not a private matter of personal belief. It was a public safety system. And if you failed to uphold your end of the deal with the gods, Rome treated it less like a spiritual mistake and more like negligent endangerment. Romans believed their relationship with the gods was transactional. You perform the ritual correctly, the gods maintain order. You mess it up, the gods get annoyed, and suddenly the city is on fire. Crops are failing, and everyone is asking who angered Jupiter this week. So Rome enforced religious contracts. Public officials were required to perform sacrifices, prayers, and rituals with obsessive precision. Wrong words, wrong timing, wrong animal, wrong hand gesture. Any of it could invalidate the ritual. And if a ritual was invalid, it had to be repeated immediately, because half-pleasing a god was considered worse than not trying at all. Private citizens weren't off the hook either. Vows made to the gods were legally binding. If you promised a deity something and failed to deliver, you could be fined, shamed, or punished. This wasn't superstition from Rome's perspective. It was risk management. Rome had no meteorologists, no epidemiology, no disaster forecasting. When something went wrong, divine displeasure was the most logical explanation available. And when the explanation is divine anger, enforcement becomes urgent. This system also served a political function. Religion unified the population around shared rituals. It created predictability. Everyone knew when festivals occurred. Everyone knew what sacrifices meant. Everyone knew that if things went badly, someone had failed to follow protocol, and that someone would be investigated. Importantly, Rome didn't care what you believed in your heart. Belief was optional. Participation was mandatory. You could privately doubt the gods all you wanted, as long as you publicly performed the rituals correctly. Rome valued behavior over belief, a very Roman approach. Breaking religious contracts threatened collective confidence. If people believed the gods were displeased, panic followed. Panic led to unrest. Unrest led to instability. Rome did not enjoy instability. So yes, Rome punished people for upsetting invisible beings. Not because Rome was irrational, but because Rome understood that shared belief systems, however strange, hold societies together. To Rome, keeping the gods happy was not theology. It was infrastructure. In ancient Rome, words were not harmless. They were dangerous tools, sharp, contagious, and fully capable of burning the city down without ever lighting a fire. Rome understood something modern societies often relearn the hard way. One convincing speaker in the wrong place at the wrong time can do more damage than an army. So Rome watched public speech very closely. You could not simply stand in a public space and start addressing a crowd. That wasn't free expression. That was suspicious behavior. Unauthorized speeches were treated as potential threats, especially if they involved criticism of officials, emotional language, or worst of all, promises to fix everything. Rome had seen this before. Charismatic speakers stirred resentment. Resentment gathered crowds. Crowds demanded action. Action turned into riots, assassinations, or civil war. Rome preferred boredom to bloodshed. Only certain people were allowed to speak publicly in official contexts. Magistrates, senators, priests, or those explicitly permitted. Even then, there were expectations about tone. Calm, measured, controlled. Shouting was frowned upon. Emotional appeals were risky. If your speech made people feel too much, Rome started paying attention. This control extended into politics. Electioneering had limits. Personal attacks were regulated. Gathering large groups required approval. Rome wasn't trying to silence debate. It was trying to keep debate from mutating into mob behavior. And Rome absolutely distrusted spontaneous crowds. If people suddenly gathered around a speaker, authorities assumed something was wrong. No one thought, an inspiring talk. They thought, who is manipulating whom? There was also a class dimension. The elite were trained in rhetoric. The masses were not. Allowing unrestricted public speaking risked giving influence to people who were persuasive but not invested in maintaining order. Rome didn't mind ideas. It minded unpredictable influence. This is why Roman leaders often spoke from elevated platforms in designated spaces at approved times. Structure mattered. Control mattered. The city was already loud enough. So yes, Rome regulated who could speak, where, and how. Not because it hated speech, but because it feared what speech could become once emotions took over. Rome trusted law. It distrusted crowds, and it never forgot that revolutions often begin with someone saying, "Hear me out." In ancient Rome, adultery was not treated as a private relationship issue. It was treated as a public threat. Rome did not ask, "Are you happy?" Rome asked, "Will this cause legal chaos in 3 generations?" Under Roman law, adultery was a crime. Not because Romans were moral Puritans, but because they were obsessed with lineage, inheritance, and social clarity. Who fathered which child mattered enormously. Property, citizenship, family alliances, and political futures all depended on knowing exactly whose bloodline continued where. Adultery introduced uncertainty, and Rome hated uncertainty. If a married woman had an affair, the question wasn't romance. The question was legitimacy. Whose child is this? Who inherits the estate? Which family gains power? Which family loses it? One affair could unravel generations of legal planning. Rome preferred to shut that down immediately. Men, of course, were treated differently because Rome affairs with enslaved people, or pro. Did you know in ancient Rome, what you wore could get you in big trouble? The color purple was a huge deal. Only the emperor could rock a full purple toga. Senators got a stripe, but that's it. Try to wear more, and you'd face serious consequences. It was all about showing your status. And it wasn't just clothes. There were rules for everything, even dinner parties. Laws dictated how many guests you could have and how much you could spend on food. Imagine getting a fine for having too fancy a feast. These rules, called sumptuary laws, were designed to control spending and maintain the social order. From fashion to food, every part of Roman life was regulated to keep everyone in their place. It's wild to think about, right? Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, hit that like button and subscribe for more peeks into the past. Did you know that before becoming one of the most famous artists in history, Vincent van Gogh tried his hand at several other careers? Born in the Netherlands in 1853, his early life was a journey of searching for his true calling. His father was a pastor, and for a while, Vincent followed a similar path, working as a lay preacher in a poor coal mining region in Belgium. He was deeply moved by the miners' difficult lives, a compassion that would later fuel his art. Before that, he even worked as an art dealer, just like his uncle. He was employed in London and Paris, surrounded by incredible art. But the commercial side of the business just didn't sit right with him. He also tried teaching and working in a bookstore. It wasn't until he was 27 that Vincent decided to dedicate his life to art. Encouraged by his brother Theo, he began to draw and paint with incredible passion. This wasn't a story of overnight success, but a long, difficult search for purpose. And this challenging journey is what shaped the emotional depth we see in his masterpieces today. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this little slice of art history, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. When he felt too deeply. This combination did not make him popular. In his late teens, Vincent began working for an art dealership, Goupil and Company. Ironically, he sold paintings long before he ever painted one. At first, he was competent, even promising, but once again, intensity ruined balance. He grew contemptuous of art buyers, disgusted by commerce, convinced that art should be sacred rather than traded like furniture. He preached to customers. Management was not impressed. Throughout these years, letters to his brother Theo reveal a man already at war with himself. Vincent longed to be useful, to matter, to serve something higher, God, humanity, truth. He tried religion. He tried teaching. He tried preaching to miners, giving away his clothes, and sleeping on the floor like a martyr in training. Each attempt ended the same way. rejection, failure, silence. By his late 20s, Vincent was broke, unemployed, and emotionally exhausted. Yet beneath the failures, something restless was sharpening. He had not yet picked up a brush with conviction, but the hunger was there. A need to translate inner storms into something visible. The quiet village that once confined him had unknowingly produced a man who would later make the entire world feel his unease. By the time Vincent van Gogh reached his late 20s, failure had become a familiar companion. He had tried religion, education, and moral devotion, and each path had quietly shut its door in his face. It was only after exhausting nearly every other identity that he turned almost reluctantly toward art. Painting was not a childhood dream fulfilled. It was a last refuge, a place where his intensity might finally have a purpose instead of being a liability. At first, Vincent did not aim to be great. He aimed to be honest. He began by drawing peasants, laborers, worn faces, and bent backs. These were people he understood, not socially, but spiritually. He studied anatomy obsessively, filling notebooks with hands, boots, spines, and skulls. His early work was dark, heavy, almost muddy, as if light itself had to struggle to exist on the canvas. Beauty for Vincent was not decorative. It was earned through endurance. During this period, his brother Theo became more than family. He became lifeline, patron, and emotional anchor. Theo sent money regularly, not out of obligation, but belief. In return, Vincent sent letters, hundreds of them, raw, philosophical, and painfully sincere. These letters reveal a man constantly questioning his worth, his sanity, and whether suffering itself might be the price of seeing the world clearly. Vincent studied art formally in fits and starts, never quite fitting into academic systems. He admired artists who painted ordinary life with dignity rather than fantasy. He rejected polish. He wanted truth, even if it was ugly. This mindset made his progress slow and his frustration immense. He destroyed works, restarted endlessly, and criticized himself with a cruelty no teacher could match. Loneliness intensified everything. Vincent wanted connection desperately, yet pushed people away with the same force. He fell in love recklessly, often with women who did not return his feelings. Each rejection deepened his belief that he was fundamentally misaligned with the world. Still, he painted, not because it made him happy, but because not painting felt worse. What began to emerge during these years was not mastery, but vision. Vincent was learning how to see, not surfaces, but emotional weight. Fields were no longer landscapes. Faces were no longer faces. Everything became charged with inner meaning. Art was no longer a profession. It was survival. The real transformation in Vincent's art began when he left the gray skies of the north and moved south to Paris. The city was loud, crowded, and overwhelming, but it exposed him to something that would permanently alter his vision: color as emotion. Here he encountered impressionists and modern painters who treated light not as an accessory, but as a subject. For Vincent, this was not a stylistic lesson. It was a revelation. Until then, his palette had been dark and earthy, shaped by coal mines, poverty, and moral gravity. In Paris, color arrived like a shock to the nervous system. Yellows burned, blues vibrated, greens refused to sit quietly. Vincent absorbed everything with manic intensity, studying brushwork, composition, and theory, while simultaneously rejecting imitation. He was not interested in blending in. He wanted color to speak, to shout, to bleed, feeling directly onto the canvas. This period was productive, but unstable. Vincent painted constantly, sometimes finishing multiple works in a single week. His brush. The canvas was no longer a window. It was a battlefield. Living with other artists proved difficult. Vincent admired them deeply, yet clashed constantly. He began to believe that color itself could replace realism, that a field did not need to look like a field if it felt like one. Seeking light, warmth, and clarity, Vincent left Paris and traveled south to Arles. He rented a small house with yellow walls. To Vincent, it was a vision, a home for artists. The sunlight of Arles transformed his work. Colors intensified. Yellows became blazing, blues deepened. When Paul Gauguin arrived, hope surged. But beneath the collaboration, tension brewed. Their personalities clashed. Vincent's mental state began to fracture. After a heated confrontation, Vincent suffered a psychological crisis and mutilated his own ear. Gauguin left. The dream ended. Vincent was hospitalized. Yet even in collapse, Vincent painted, translating suffering into form. He described feeling trapped inside his own head, watching himself unravel. But between these storms came intervals of calm, and during those moments, he painted with extraordinary focus. The asylum garden became one of his primary subjects. Irises, olive trees, cypresses, nature rendered not as background, but as emotional force. His brush strokes grew more rhythmic, almost musical, swirling and pulsing with contained intensity. These were not peaceful paintings. They were controlled explosions, order imposed on inner chaos. From his small room, Vincent painted the view outside his barred window. The sky fascinated him, vast, unreachable, alive. It was during this time that he created some of his most iconic works, including the night sky that seems to move, breathe, and twist under unseen pressure. These paintings were not fantasies. They were perceptions filtered through a mind perpetually on edge. Despite his productivity, Vincent remained deeply uncertain about his worth. He sold almost nothing. Recognition did not come. Letters to Theo reveal gratitude mixed with guilt. Gratitude for support, guilt for being a burden. He worried constantly that his illness made him useless, that his art was compensation rather than contribution. Yet something remarkable occurred within those walls. Vincent began to understand that painting did not require happiness. It required honesty. The asylum stripped away illusions of normal life, leaving him with nothing but sensation, memory, and feeling, and that was enough. Saint Remy did not heal Vincent, but it gave him structure long enough to create work that feels timeless precisely because it was born from instability. He was not painting despite his suffering. He was painting through it moment by moment, storm by storm. After a year inside the asylum, Vincent was released into the care of a physician near Paris, settling in the quiet village of Aux-Saules. On the surface, this move signaled recovery. He was closer to Theo under medical supervision and surrounded by open countryside that invited long walks and steady work. For the first time in years, there was cautious optimism, not happiness, but the possibility of balance. Vincent painted relentlessly. Fields of wheat, village streets, gardens, and portraits poured from him at astonishing speed. Sometimes he completed a canvas in a single sitting, driven by an urgency that felt both productive and ominous. His style reached full maturity here. Bold colors, vibrating lines, compositions that seemed to pulse with nervous energy. The landscapes were expansive yet unsettled. The sky often pressed down. The fields felt restless, never still. Though his output was immense, his inner state remained fragile. Vincent was acutely aware that his stability depended on others, especially Theo. When Theo began to struggle financially and emotionally, Vincent felt the ground shift beneath him. He worried he was a burden, an obligation that never ended. Success still refused to arrive in any meaningful way. A few critics took notice, but recognition was distant and abstract. It did not translate into security. His letters from this period reveal a man caught between hope and dread. One moment he speaks of future plans, new techniques, a belief that his work may finally matter. The next he expresses fear that his illness will return without warning, that his mind will betray him again. The calm he experienced felt temporary, borrowed, and fragile. Vincent also felt profoundly alone. While surrounded by nature and people, he remained emotionally isolated, unable to fully connect or rest. The very intensity that fueled his art made ordinary life exhausting. He could paint endlessly, but living quietly seemed impossible. The countryside of Overs reflected this tension. It was beautiful, open, and alive, yet charged with unease. Vincent did not paint peaceful fields. He painted fields under pressure, skies in motion, paths that seemed to lead nowhere. Did you know that many of Vincent van Gogh's most famous paintings, like The Starry Night, were created while he was in a mental asylum? It's a powerful story of creativity against all odds. After a severe mental health crisis in Arles, Van Gogh voluntarily admitted himself to the St. Paul de Maussou Asylum in 1889. From his window, he saw the swirling night sky that would become his masterpiece. He painted prolifically during this time, creating over 150 paintings in just 1 year. His art was a lifeline, a way to process his inner turmoil and find beauty in the world around him. Tragically, his life was cut short just a year later. Despite his struggles, Van Gogh's legacy is one of resilience and the incredible power of art to heal and inspire. If you found this story moving, hit that like button and subscribe for more art history deep dives. Each finished canvas brought a brief sense of order, followed almost immediately by the familiar question, and then what? He produced work at a pace that felt less like inspiration and more like necessity, as if stopping would allow something worse to surface. His relationship with Theo weighed heavily on him. Theo's health was declining, his job uncertain, his family growing. Vincent sensed, perhaps accurately, perhaps not, that the support he relied on could not last forever. This fear cut deeply. The idea that his existence might cause suffering to the one person who believed in him was unbearable. He wrote with increasing anxiety, apologizing for being alive, for costing money, for needing care. Despite moments of external recognition, Vincent felt no internal confirmation. Praise arrived too late and too softly. He did not see himself as a misunderstood genius. He saw himself as unfinished, unstable, and unresolved. The world seemed unwilling to meet him halfway, and he lacked the strength to keep reaching. His paintings from this time grow darker in mood without losing intensity. The colors remain bold, but harmony dissolves. Crows cut across skies. Paths split and vanish. Horizons tilt slightly, never offering rest. These works feel suspended between movement and collapse, as if the land itself shares his unease. Vincent spoke little about the future. Plans dissolved into vague possibilities. What remained was exhaustion, mental, emotional, and physical. Years of inner struggle had left him worn down, not dramatically, but quietly. There was no single breaking moment, only accumulation. The countryside that once promised calm now felt indifferent. Wide open spaces emphasized isolation rather than freedom. Vincent had always lived intensely, and intensity demands energy. By this stage, the energy was nearly gone. This chapter of his life is defined not by chaos, but by heaviness. A man still working, still seeing, still creating, yet carrying a silence that had grown too dense to escape. In late July of 1890, Vincent's life narrowed to its final fragile shape. The days were warm, the wheat fields tall and restless under the wind. Outwardly, nothing dramatic announced the end. There was no public breakdown, no final manifesto. Vincent continued his routine, walking, painting, returning to his room. Yet something inside him had quietly reached its limit. On one afternoon, Vincent walked into the fields alone. He carried with him the same tools he always did. But this time, painting was no longer enough. What happened next was not impulsive madness, but a tired decision made by a man who had spent years negotiating with pain. He shot himself in the chest. The wound was not immediately fatal. Remarkably, Vincent managed to walk back to his lodging. He collapsed onto his bed, bleeding, conscious, and calm. When questioned, he reportedly said little. There was no anger, no dramatic explanation, only acceptance. And for a long time, the answer was yes. That's why Rome's weirdest rules weren't mistakes. They were warnings. Vincent van Gogh entered the world in 1853 in the small Dutch village of Zundert, a place so quiet it almost seemed designed to magnify inner noise. He was born exactly 1 year after a stillborn brother, also named Vincent, a fact that would quietly haunt his sense of identity for the rest of his life. From an early age, he grew up with the unsettling awareness that he was, in a way, a replacement. Each Sunday, walking past a gravestone bearing his own name, he was reminded that existence could be fragile, accidental, and painfully symbolic. His father was a Protestant pastor, strict but sincere, while his mother was artistic, fond of drawing flowers and arranging nature with careful hands. From her, Vincent absorbed a sensitivity to color and form. From his father, a moral seriousness that would later turn into obsession. He was not a cheerful child. Teachers described him as intense, awkward, and distant. Other children played. Vincent stared. He watched people the way others watched weather, silently trying to understand patterns. School never suited him. He drifted from place to place, unable to settle, increasingly isolated. Social rules felt artificial to him, like poorly written instructions everyone else pretended to understand. He wanted meaning, purpose, something absolute. When he spoke, he often spoke too much. When he felt too deeply. This combination did not make him popular. In his late teens, Vincent began working for an art dealership, Goupil and Company. Ironically, he sold paintings long before he ever painted one. At first, he was competent, even promising, but once again, intensity ruined balance. He grew contemptuous of art buyers, disgusted by commerce, convinced that art should be sacred rather than traded like furniture. He preached to customers. Management was not impressed. Throughout these years, letters to his brother Theo reveal a man already at war with himself. Vincent longed to be useful, to matter, to serve something higher, God, humanity, truth. He tried religion. He tried teaching. He tried preaching to minors, giving away his clothes, and sleeping on the floor like a martyr in training. Each attempt ended the same way. Rejection, failure, silence. By his late 20s, Vincent was broke, unemployed, and emotionally exhausted. Yet beneath the failures, something restless was sharpening. He had not yet picked up a brush with conviction, but the hunger was there. A need to translate inner storms into something visible. The quiet village that once confined him had unknowingly produced a man who would later make the entire world feel his unease. By the time Vincent van Gogh reached his late 20s, failure had become a familiar companion. He had tried religion, education, and moral devotion, and each path had quietly shut its door in his face. It was only after exhausting nearly every other identity that he turned almost reluctantly toward art. Painting was not a childhood dream fulfilled. It was a last refuge, a place where his intensity might finally have a purpose instead of being a liability. At first, Vincent did not aim to be great. He aimed to be honest. He began by drawing peasants, laborers, worn faces, and bent backs. These were people he understood, not socially, but spiritually. He studied anatomy obsessively, filling notebooks with hands, boots, spines, and skulls. His early work was dark, heavy, almost muddy, as if light itself had to struggle to exist on the canvas. Beauty for Vincent was not decorative. It was earned through endurance. During this period, his brother Theo became more than family. He became lifeline, patron, and emotional anchor. Theo sent money regularly, not out of obligation, but belief. In return, Vincent sent letters, hundreds of them, raw, philosophical, and painfully sincere. These letters reveal a man constantly questioning his worth, his sanity, and whether suffering itself might be the price of seeing the world clearly. Vincent studied art formally in fits and starts, never quite fitting into academic systems. He admired artists who painted ordinary life with dignity rather than fantasy. He rejected polish. He wanted truth, even if it was ugly. When you think of a starving artist, who comes to mind? For many, it's Vincent van Gogh, a man who sold only one painting in his lifetime. Yet today, his works fetch hundreds of millions of dollars. But who was the man behind the vibrant sunflowers and swirling starry nights? Let's uncover the story of Vincent van Gogh. Born in the Netherlands in 1853, Vincent's early life was anything but artistic. He tried his hand at being an art dealer, a teacher, and even a missionary before picking up a paintbrush at the age of 27. His early works, like The Potato Eaters, were dark and somber, reflecting the harsh lives of the Dutch peasants he lived among. You can really feel the grit and struggle in these early pieces. But everything changed when he moved to Paris in 1886. The city was bursting with color and new ideas. He met Impressionist painters like Monet and Pissarro, and their influence was explosive. Vincent's palette burst into life. He abandoned the dark, earthy tones for bright, bold colors, developing the passionate brushstrokes we know and love today. This was the birth of the Van Gogh we recognize. Seeking even brighter light, he moved to Arles in the south of France. This period was incredibly prolific. He painted his famous Sunflower series, his bedroom in Arles, and the vibrant Café Terrace at night. He dreamed of starting an artist's colony, a studio of the South, and invited his friend, the painter Paul Gauguin, to join him. However, their relationship was intense and volatile. After a heated argument, a distraught Vincent infamously cut off a piece of his own left ear. This event marked the beginning of a severe decline in his mental health. He voluntarily admitted himself to an asylum in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. Even in the asylum, Vincent never stopped painting. It was here, from his barred window, that he created one of the most iconic paintings in all of art history. The Starry Night. You can see the turmoil in the swirling cypress tree and the explosive energy of the stars. But there's also a sense of peace in the sleeping village below. It's a window into his soul, a mix of chaos and hope. Tragically, Vincent's battle with his inner demons continued. In 1890, at the age of just 37, he died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. In his short 10-year career, he created over 2,100 artworks, including around 860 oil paintings. He poured his entire being onto the canvas, writing in a letter to his brother Theo, "I put my heart and my soul into my work and have lost my mind in the process." Vincent van Gogh's story is one of passion, struggle, and immense talent. He saw the world in a way no one else did and had the courage to paint it. His art shows us that even in the darkest of times, there is incredible beauty to be found. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, please know that help is available and you are not alone. We've included some resources in the description below. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into art history, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. When Paul Gauguin arrived to join him, hope surged. Vincent admired Gauguin deeply and believed their partnership could define a new era of art. At first, they worked together, talked endlessly, and challenged one another. Yet, beneath the collaboration, tension brewed. Their personalities clashed. Gauguin was controlled and distant. Vincent volatile and emotionally exposed. Conversations turned sharp. Criticism felt like betrayal. Vincent's mental state began to fracture under the pressure. He feared abandonment constantly, terrified that Gauguin would leave and the dream would collapse. Sleeplessness, paranoia, and emotional instability intensified. The house that was meant to symbolize unity became a space charged with anxiety. The breaking point came suddenly and violently. After a heated confrontation, Vincent suffered a psychological crisis. In a moment of profound distress, he mutilated his own ear, an act that has since overshadowed much of his work. Though it was not madness and isolation, but the result of prolonged strain, isolation, and inner torment. Gauguin left. The dream ended. Vincent was hospitalized, confused, ashamed, and devastated. The yellow house stood nearly empty, its walls still bright, but stripped of hope. Yet even in collapse, Vincent painted. From hospital rooms and moments of clarity, he continued to work, translating suffering into form. Arl gave him his most vivid colors and his deepest wounds. The dream of belonging had failed, but it revealed something brutal and undeniable. Vincent could not escape himself. All he could do was paint what lived inside. After the collapse in Ailes, Vincent voluntarily entered the asylum at Sawney, a former monastery surrounded by olive groves and stone corridors that echoed with quiet suffering. It was a place meant to contain chaos, not cure it. Yet for Vincent, confinement brought a strange, fragile order. The world narrowed. Distractions fell away. What remained was the constant battle inside his mind and a window through which he could still see the sky. Life in the asylum moved slowly, punctuated by episodes of severe mental distress. There were days when Vincent could not speak clearly, could not work, could not trust his own thoughts. During these periods, he was overwhelmed by hallucinations, confusion, and fear. He described feeling trapped inside his own head, watching himself unravel. But between these storms came intervals of calm, and during those moments, he painted with extraordinary focus. The asylum garden became one of his primary subjects. Irises, olive trees, cypresses, nature rendered not as background, but as emotional force. His brush strokes grew more rhythmic, almost musical, swirling and pulsing with contained intensity. These were not peaceful paintings. They were controlled explosions, order imposed on inner chaos. From his small room, Vincent painted the view outside his barred window. The sky fascinated him, vast, unreachable, alive. It was during this time that he created some of his most iconic works, including the night sky that seems to move, breathe, and twist under unseen pressure. These paintings were not fantasies. They were perceptions filtered through a mind perpetually on edge. Despite his productivity, Vincent remained deeply uncertain about his worth. He sold almost nothing. Recognition did not come. Letters to Theo revealed gratitude mixed with guilt. Gratitude for support, guilt for being a burden. He worried constantly that his illness made him useless, that his art was compensation rather than contribution. Yet something remarkable occurred within those walls. Vincent began to understand that painting did not require happiness. It required honesty. The asylum stripped away illusions of normal life, leaving him with nothing but sensation, memory, and feeling, and that was enough. Saint Remy did not heal Vincent, but it gave him structure long enough to create work that feels timeless precisely because it was born from instability. He was not painting despite his suffering. He was painting through it moment by moment, storm by storm. After a year inside the asylum, Vincent was released into the care of a physician near Paris, settling in the quiet village of Eaux-Saules. On the surface, this move signaled recovery. He was closer to Theo under medical supervision and surrounded by open countryside that invited long walks and steady work. For the first time in years, there was cautious optimism, not happiness, but the possibility of balance. Vincent painted relentlessly. Fields of wheat, village streets, gardens, and portraits poured from him at astonishing speed. Sometimes he completed a canvas in a single sitting, driven by an urgency that felt both productive and ominous. His style reached full maturity here. Bold colors, vibrating lines, compositions that seemed to pulse with nervous energy. The landscapes were expansive, yet unsettled. The sky often pressed down. The fields felt restless. In the summer of 1890, Vincent van Gogh painted nearly a canvas a day. This frantic pace wasn't just creative genius. It was a desperate race against time and his own mind. His final letters to his brother Theo are heartbreaking. You can feel the weight of his loneliness and the immense pressure he felt to succeed, not for fame, but to ease the financial burden on his beloved brother. Look closely at his last paintings, like wheat field with crows, the turbulent sky, the dark, menacing crows, the roads that lead to nowhere. It's all there. It's a raw visual diary of a man battling severe depression. While we often romanticize his madness, it's crucial to remember the real human suffering behind the masterpieces. His art became his only way to communicate the storm raging inside him, leaving us with a powerful, beautiful, and tragic legacy. Thanks for watching. Vincent had always lived with an intensity that burned through energy. But by July of 1890, that energy was nearly gone. His life wasn't chaotic anymore. It was heavy with a silence too dense to escape. The days were warm, the wheat fields restless under the wind. Outwardly, nothing seemed wrong. Vincent kept his routine, walking, painting, returning to his room. But inside, he had reached his limit. One afternoon, he walked into the fields, carrying his usual tools. But this time, painting wasn't enough. What followed wasn't madness, but a tired decision. He shot himself in the chest. Remarkably, he walked back to his lodging and collapsed, conscious and calm. His brother Theo rushed to his side. For 2 days, they spoke quietly. Vincent wasn't angry or regretful. He simply said, "The sadness will last forever." On July 29th, At 37, Vincent van Gogh died. The world barely noticed, but he left behind a legacy that would change art forever. They were memory made audible, rhythm passed from body to body, generation to generation, even when language and homeland were stripped away. At the same time, European musical traditions brought structure, harmony, notation, instruments, and formal training. Marching bands played precise arrangements. Opera houses staged grand works. Conservatory-trained musicians lived just blocks away from self-taught players who learned by ear. In New Orleans, these worlds did not stay separate. They listened to each other. Crucially, the city did not demand purity. You could borrow, bend, distort, and recombine. Mistakes were tolerated. Improvisation was not failure. It was expected. Music here was something you did, not something you perfected. Jazz did not begin as a rebellion or a movement. It emerged quietly from this environment, the way humidity rises from warm ground. New Orleans did not invent jazz on purpose. It simply created the conditions where it could not help but exist. The soul of jazz was forged long before the first trumpet bent a note. Its earliest heartbeat came from people who had everything taken from them except rhythm. Enslaved Africans brought with them musical traditions that could not be erased. Polyrhythms, call and response, movement tied directly to sound. Even under oppression, music survived because it adapted. It became quieter when it had to. It became communal when solitude was dangerous. Most of all, it became emotional truth in sonic form. In New Orleans, sorrow did not stay silent. Work songs rose from docks and fields, keeping time for labor while giving voice to exhaustion and endurance. Spirituals carried grief upward, blending African musical memory with Christian imagery. These were not songs meant to impress. They were songs meant to hold people together. Rhythm became structure. Repetition became reassurance. Unlike much of the United States, New Orleans allowed certain musical practices to persist publicly. Black musicians played openly in parades, funerals, and social gatherings. Music followed people from birth to burial. Funerals themselves became musical journeys. Slow, mournful processions on the way to the grave, then joyful, defiant rhythms on the way back. Death did not end music. It sharpened it. Blues began to take shape here too, not as a formal genre, but as an emotional vocabulary. Bent notes, vocal inflections, and unresolved tension expressed something words could not. Pain was not hidden. It was shaped, stretched, and released. This emotional honesty would become one of jazz's defining features. Importantly, these traditions were never static. Musicians listened constantly to each other, to European harmony drifting in from opera, houses to Caribbean rhythms arriving through the port. They borrowed freely. A hymn could become a dance tune. A march could become something looser, stranger, more alive. Strict time began to soften. Space appeared between beats. Music started to breathe. Improvisation grew naturally from this environment. When life itself was unstable, rigid repetition made little sense. Musicians learned to respond in the moment, to a crowd, to another player, to emotion itself. This was not chaos. It was conversation. By the end of the 19th century, something new was forming. It did not yet have a name, but it had a feel. A rhythm that swung, melodies that bent, and an emotional range that could hold grief and joy at the same time. Jazz was not born from happiness. It was born from survival, learning how to move. As the 19th century drew to a close, the sound forming in New Orleans began to develop recognizable voices. These were not composers in the traditional sense, nor virtuosos chasing perfection. They were working musicians, barbers, laborers, dock workers, men who played because music was woven into daily life. Among them emerged figures spoken of with reverence, even when no recording survived. One of the most mythic was Buddy Bolden, a cornet player whose influence loomed larger than his documented legacy. Bolden was not famous for technical precision. He was famous for volume, emotion, and freedom. He played loud enough to be heard across neighborhoods, bending notes, stretching rhythm, and injecting raw feeling into structured marches. Listeners said his sound carried something dangerous, unpredictable, alive. He played what people felt but could not say. Around players like Bolden, a new approach emerged. Musicians stopped treating melodies as fixed objects. A tune became a framework, something to push against. One instrument would state a theme, another would respond, a third would comment. This collective improvisation was not rehearsed chaos. It was instinctive collaboration. Everyone listened. Everyone reacted. Much of this music flowed through Storyville, the city's legalized red light district. Storyville was morally condemned and culturally indispensable. Bars, brothel, and dance halls needed music constantly, and they paid for it. Musicians played nightly, learning how to hold attention, build energy, and adapt instantly to shifting moods. If a room wanted heat, they delivered heat. If it wanted melancholy, They slowed the air itself. Crucially, racial boundaries shaped the sound in complex ways. Creole musicians often had formal training and could read music fluently. Black musicians often learned by ear, emphasizing rhythm and feel. When segregation laws forced these groups into closer proximity, their approaches collided. Technique met intuition, structure met swing. The result was not compromise, but expansion. The instruments themselves began to matter differently. Cornets led melodies, clarinets twisted around them. Trombones growled from below. Rhythm sections loosened time, letting music sway instead of march. This was no longer European music played differently. It was something new. By the early 1900s, the sound had crossed a threshold. It was still unnamed, still evolving, but it was unmistakable. Jazz was no longer an idea forming in the background. It had stepped forward and found its first voices. If early jazz was a conversation, then Louis Armstrong changed its grammar. Born into deep poverty in New Orleans, Armstrong's childhood was marked by instability, violence, and hunger. Music was not an aspiration at first. It was an accident of survival. After a troubled incident as a boy, he was sent to a reform home where he first learned to play the cornet. What began as discipline quickly became destiny. Armstrong absorbed the city's sound the way others absorb language. He listened constantly to brass bands, to street parades, to old. Armstrong's horn spoke. His tone was bold, clear, and emotionally direct. You could recognize it instantly, even in a crowd. Jazz before Armstrong emphasized group expression. Everyone played at once, weaving lines together. Armstrong did not destroy this tradition, but he reshaped it. He brought the individual forward. His solos were not decorative breaks. They were statements, stories told with confidence, humor, and authority. When Armstrong played, time seemed to reorganize around him. Equally revolutionary was his sense of rhythm. Armstrong did not simply follow the beat. He leaned against it, stretched it, danced with it. This created what later musicians would call swing, a feeling impossible to notate, but instantly recognizable. Jazz stopped marching. It started breathing. His influence spread quickly. Other musicians adjusted their playing in response, giving solos more space, more narrative weight. Bands reorganized themselves around featured players. Jazz began shifting from collective texture to individual voice without losing its communal roots. Armstrong also transformed jazz vocals. His growly voice, playful phrasing, and spontaneous scat singing treated the human voice like another instrument. Singing no longer meant precision or polish. It meant expression. Feeling mattered more than perfection. What Armstrong represented was possibility. He showed that jazz could carry personality without losing soul, structure without stiffness. Through him, jazz stepped onto a larger stage, not by abandoning its origins, but by amplifying them. New Orleans had given jazz its bones. Armstrong gave it a spine and a face the world would remember. As jazz matured, New Orleans could no longer contain it. Economic pressure, racial violence, and the tightening grip of segregation pushed thousands of black families northward in what became known as the Great Migration. Musicians moved with them, carrying their sound like a passport. Jazz did not leave New Orleans behind. It took the city with it, compressed into memory, rhythm, and style. Chicago became one of the first major destinations. There, jazz found louder rooms, bigger audiences, and longer nights. The music changed in response. Collective improvisation gave way to sharper solos. Bands tightened their arrangements. The pace quickened. Urban life demanded urgency, and jazz obliged. What had once floated through open streets now bounced off brick walls and smoke-filled clubs. New York followed, especially Harlem, where jazz met ambition on an industrial scale. The music entered ballrooms, theaters, and recording studios. It learned how to project. It learned how to sell without surrendering its core. Musicians competed, collaborated, and experimented relentlessly. Jazz became both art and profession, shaped by the realities of rent, reputation, and racial barriers. Recording technology played a critical role. For the first time, jazz could travel without musicians. Records froze improvisation into repeatable moments, spreading styles rapidly, but also locking certain versions into history. This created tension. Jazz thrived on spontaneity, yet fame now depended on consistency. Musicians navigated this contradiction constantly. Despite these changes, the New Orleans spirit endured. Even as arrangements grew more complex, the music retained its emotional directness. Swing still mattered. Grooves still ruled. Jazz did not become polite. It became sharper. Importantly, leaving New Orleans did not erase its influence. It magnified it. Musicians referenced home constantly, whether through repertoire, rhythm, or attitude. The city became a mythic origin point, a place of authenticity against which all new developments were measured. Jazz's expansion proved something essential. It was not a local curiosity. It was a living language capable of adapting without losing meaning. Wherever it landed, it absorbed new influences and reshaped them just as it had done at birth. New Orleans had released jazz into the world. The world did not dilute it. It tested it. And jazz survived by changing without forgetting where it learned how to breathe. As jazz settled into northern cities, it entered a new phase, one defined by confidence, scale, and self-awareness. No longer a regional sound fighting for legitimacy, jazz began to see itself as a cultural force. This transformation was most visible in Harlem, where music became inseparable from identity, pride, and modern Black expression. Dance halls and ballrooms expanded the music's reach. Big bands replaced smaller ensembles, not to tame jazz, but to amplify it. Arrangements grew more sophisticated, balancing tight orchestration with moments of freedom. This was not jazz abandoning improvisation. It was jazz learning how to command space. At the center of this evolution stood figures like Duke Ellington. Ellington did not treat jazz as raw material to be refined into something respectable. He treated it as already worthy. His compositions were lush, dramatic, and deeply rooted in Black musical tradition. He wrote for specific musicians, shaping music around personality rather than forcing players into uniform roles. Jazz in his hands became orchestral without losing intimacy. Ellington's work proved something crucial. Jazz could be complex without becoming cold. It could be elegant without losing grit. It could sit on grand stages and still speak directly to lived experience. This redefinition shifted how audiences listened. Jazz was no longer just something you danced to. It was something you heard. At the same time, vocalists began reshaping jazz's emotional range. Singers used phrasing as improvisation, bending time and melody to tell personal stories. Lyrics became less ornamental and more confessional. Jazz allowed vulnerability without apology. Yet success brought tension. As jazz gained popularity, commercial pressures increased. Clubs demanded consistency. Radio favored familiarity. Musicians faced the challenge of staying inventive in systems that rewarded repetition. Some adapted, others resisted. The push and pull between innovation and acceptance became a defining struggle. Still, the core spirit held. Jazz remained music of presence, created in the moment, shaped by who was in the room and what they felt. It continued to reward listening, risk, and response. This chapter marked jazz's coronation. It was no longer emerging. It had arrived, complex, confident, and self-aware. What lay ahead would test its boundaries even further. But its voice was now unmistakable, strong enough to argue with itself and survive the argument. Once jazz had a crown, it immediately began questioning whether it deserved one. The very success that lifted the music into ballroom, his playing searched relentlessly for meaning, stretching improvisation into spiritual inquiry. Notes piled into torrent, then dissolved into silence. Coltrane treated music as a form of devotion, not to religion alone, but to truth itself. Jazz became a vehicle for transcendence. Other musicians explored space, texture, and freedom. Some rejected fixed harmony entirely. Others fused jazz with funk, rock, and global traditions. Purists complained. Innovators listened forward. Jazz had always absorbed its surroundings. Now the surroundings were global. What united these divergent paths was not style, but method. Jazz still relied on listening, response, and presence. Musicians met in the moment, negotiated sound in real time, and accepted uncertainty as part of creation. Even the most experimental forms remained rooted in conversation. Importantly, jazz also became a language of resistance. In a world shaped by segregation, political unrest, and cultural upheaval, improvisation itself carried meaning. To play freely was to assert humanity. To bend structure was to question authority. Jazz did not shout slogans. It embodied defiance through form. By this stage, jazz could no longer be pinned to a place. It belonged to New Orleans, Chicago, Harlem, and everywhere else musicians dared to make it their own. Its origins remained audible, but its future was open. Jazz had become less about sound and more about approach. A way of thinking, a way of responding to pressure with creativity instead of collapse. The road ahead would not be simple or unified, but unity was never jazz's promise. Its promise was motion, restless, searching, alive. Jazz began in a specific place among specific people under specific pressures, but it never belonged to one era alone. What ensured its survival was not nostalgia, funding, or institutional approval. It was the fact that jazz answered a permanent human need, the need to express what cannot be neatly said. By the late 20th century, jazz was declared dead more times than it could count. It was no longer dominant on radio. It no longer defined popular dance culture. Younger audiences moved on to louder, simpler forms. Yet jazz did not vanish. It went underground into small clubs, classrooms, and private rooms where musicians still gathered for the same reason they always had, to listen and respond. What endured was the method. Jazz remained a discipline of attention. Players showed up without knowing exactly what would happen. They trusted each other enough to risk failure in public. They accepted that beauty might arrive crooked, late, or incomplete. This was not nostalgia for an old sound. It was loyalty to a way of working. Around the world, musicians took jazz and reshaped it through their own histories. In Europe, Africa, Asia, and South America, local rhythms and traditions blended naturally with improvisation. Jazz proved adaptable without erasing its identity. It did not demand imitation. It invited dialogue. Education preserved technique, but living jazz resisted confinement. The music never truly belonged to institutions. It belonged to late nights, imperfect rooms, and players willing to stay present. Wherever that attitude existed, jazz continued, even if it no longer sounded like New Orleans, Harlem, or Chicago. Most importantly, jazz never forgot where it came from. At its core remained the transformation of pressure into expression, sorrow into rhythm, constraint into movement. That lineage connected modern players back to Congo Square, to funerals that danced, to horns answering grief with sound. Jazz did not promise ease. It promised honesty. It asked musicians and listeners alike to stay awake, to feel complexity without simplifying it away. That demand kept it alive. The birth of jazz was not a moment. It was a pattern, one that continues whenever someone listens deeply, responds truthfully, and refuses silence. The city gave it breath. History tested it. Jazz endured not as a relic, but as a living way of being human. In the early 1790s, the United States existed in an uneasy space between revolution and reality. Independence had been won, but stability had not. A constitution was still new in parchment, its promises untested, its authority uncertain. For many Americans, especially those far from the coastal cities, the federal government felt less like a protector and more like a cue. Swing was popular. Swing was profitable, and SW to them was becoming safe. So jazz did what it had always done when confined. It broke its own rules. Late at night, after formal gigs ended, musicians gathered in small clubs and back rooms to experiment. Tempos accelerated, harmonies twisted, melodies fractured and reassembled. This was not music meant for dancing or easy listening. It demanded attention. It demanded effort. Jazz was reclaiming its edge. Figures like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie pushed the music into what became known as bop. Improvisation turned fierce and intellectual. Solos were no longer just expressive, they were confrontational. Musicians spoke through speed, complexity, and harmonic daring. Jazz stopped explaining itself. This shift was not elitism. It was self-defense. Pop musicians rejected the idea that jazz existed to entertain on command. They wanted autonomy. They wanted to play for each other, not for applause alone. The music returned to its roots as conversation. But now the conversation was fast, dense, and unapologetically challenging. At the same time, jazz continued to express emotional truth in quieter ways. Vocalists like Billie Holiday stripped songs down to their emotional core. Her phrasing carried pain, resilience, and lived experience with devastating clarity. Jazz proved it could be cerebral and vulnerable at once. These parallel paths, explosive experimentation and intimate expression, expanded jazz's range rather than splitting it. The music refused to be one thing. It refused containment. Critics argued audiences divided. Some declared jazz was dying. In reality, it was shedding skin. Jazz had never promised comfort. It promised honesty, even when honesty was difficult to hear. By breaking its own structure, jazz ensured survival. It remained a living language capable of argument, reinvention, and contradiction. The rules had never been the point. Expression was, and as long as musicians were willing to risk misunderstanding in pursuit of truth, jazz would continue to breathe. By the middle of the 20th century, jazz no longer moved in a single direction. It fractured, multiplied, and explored. Some feared this meant dilution. In truth, it meant freedom. Jazz had grown large enough to contain contradictions without collapsing under them. One of the central figures of this era was Miles Davis, a musician defined less by one sound than by constant reinvention. Davis understood something essential. Jazz did not survive by repeating itself. It survived by risk. Across decades, he stripped music down, slowed it, electrified it, and rebuilt it again. Each phase confused audiences. Each phase opened new doors. Alongside him, John Coltrane pushed jazz inward.
You've ever heard of a rebellion sparked by whiskey? Well, pull up a chair. Back in the 1790s, for farmers on the American frontier, life was tough. They were far from markets, and turning their corn into whiskey was a game changer. It was easier to transport, didn't spoil, and was basically their currency. But then, the new U.S. government, led by Alexander Hamilton, needed money. Their solution: a tax on distilled spirits. For the frontiersmen, this wasn't just a tax, it felt like a direct attack on their livelihood by a distant, disconnected government. Tensions boiled over. Tax collectors were tarred and feathered. Farmers took up arms. President George Washington himself had to lead a militia to put down the uprising. The Whiskey Rebellion was a crucial test for the young nation, showing that the federal government would enforce its laws. It's a fascinating and often overlooked chapter in American history. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for more.